Hi, everybody. It's really great to be back with you. And I mean, here we are. We're nearing the spring of 2021, and we're closing in. I pray on getting sprung from life in COVID time. So tonight we're going to look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911. Almost exactly 110 years later, we're going to try and grasp what made it so important in its time and why it remains relevant and important for us still in 2021. And as we're going to see, Triangle was a really pivotal moment in history, and not just for the garment industry, not just for the city of New York, not just for the state of New York. No, as we're going to see, the Triangle Fire was a defining event for the United States in the 20th century, with shockingly far reaching impacts whose echoes persist. Even though, and the questions it raises remain hotly debated, even though, as far as I can tell, the memory of Triangle itself isn't so strong among people under, let's say, 40. So here's how I'd like to proceed tonight. First, we're going to put together what the Triangle Fire was and how it happened. Second, we're going to look at its immediate and then its longer range after effects. And to do that, we're going to go in concentric circles, starting with the garment industry itself, then the city, then the state, the nation, and the century, to try to understand how it was that an industrial fire on 2 floors of a single building could possibly have such wide and long repercussions. Everybody good with that? Okay, so let's go. To set the stage, you can leave it there, right? To set the stage, let's talk about the garment business, or the rag trade, as insiders sometimes call it. Starting in the middle of the 19th century, garment making became big business in Manhattan. The city's huge population and its prime position in the nation's over water and over land transportation systems, along with the invention of the sewing machine, all led to industrializing the production of ready-to-wear, firmly planted right here in our town. And not least, garment making in New York got a big boost, turning out cheap goods for slaves in the South. The city, you see, was one of the South's major suppliers and financiers, which is why during the Civil War, Mayor Fernando Wood proposed that the city should secede from the Union so it could do business with both sides. Yeah, I'm not sure how many people know that. Now, as the garment industry grew, it developed a really bad image thanks to exposés about sweated labor, including Jacob Riis's famous photo of a Lower East Side family doing what was then called homework. Let's get the next slide. There was also proper New Yorkers' snobbishness towards the poor and immigrant people who made up the bulk of the workforce in that area. And then on top of that came a series of really famously violent labor management confrontations led by Eastern European Jewish immigrants who founded the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or ILGWU. My grandparents were living on the Lower East Side while this turmoil was going on, and I have some of their letters and cards, and I've gotten some of them translated from Yiddish into English, but so far no reference to labor unrest has surfaced, though I think that might be because the unrest was too pervasive and notorious to need mentioning. Anyway, historic labor actions went on for year after year in the early 1900s. Next slide, please. And those protests reached a turning point in the fall of 1909, 1910. Next slide. With campaigns known as the Uprising of the 20,000 and the Great Revolt, collectively known as the Great Garment Wars. These were epic battles that repeatedly shut the industry down, and among the targets of these actions was a firm known as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Sorry, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Shirtwaists were a type of blouse. Next slide. With their trim, clean silhouette, they were associated with what we'd now call feminism, the so-called new woman of the 1890s. Contrary to the huge over-the-top dresses and gowns of the high Victorians, shirtwaists were inspired by menswear. As the Wall Street Journal, of all places, put it a couple of years ago, quote, Since neither the shirtwaist nor the skirt required precise fits, they were easily mass manufactured. Result? Democratic fashion, accessible to society women and stenographers alike. Close quote. But the places in which these things were made were quite another story. Even after the Great Garment Wars, garment making meant long, long hours, 6-day work weeks, and lousy pay. Garment factories had been moving to purpose-built loft buildings instead of working out of converted tenements, and that had meant somewhat better lighting and so on, but these structures left a lot to be desired, far more than even the most severe critics of the time imagined. And to understand this, let's talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire itself. Now, the Triangle Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of what was then a state-of-the-art commercial loft building. Next slide. Built in 1901, it was a younger sibling to the cast-iron-fronted buildings of Soho, and it had all the latest safety features like fire escapes and emergency exits. Like most garment firms, though, Triangle kept those exits locked so workers couldn't take unauthorized breaks. And like most garment firms, the factory floors were crowded and messy with bolts of cloth and scraps and other stuff lying all over the place. On a cold Saturday afternoon, late in March 1911, just before closing time, somehow a fire began on the firm's 9th floor. With all the schmata lying around, the fire spread with incredible speed, and then it leaped upstairs to the 10th floor. Terrified workers found that most of the exit doors were locked, and the ones that weren't locked opened inwards, so with the crush of people trying to get out, they were difficult or impossible to get through. The building was code compliant, but it had no sprinklers, and the stairs in the elevator were inadequate, and the one and only fire escape buckled almost immediately. Next slide, please. Almost 150 workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant girls and women, found themselves trapped inside. In the space of a few minutes, as the fires howled around them, they were forced to choose between death by fire and death by leaping from the factory windows. Many picked the quicker path and jumped. Horror movie images of streets littered with exploded and fire-blackened bodies found their way onto front pages around the country. Next slide. And the next. Headlines continued as the story shifted to nearly 500,000 people who turned out to attend the funeral march for the Triangle dead, and then to the trials of the owners of the factory, all of whom were acquitted. Next slide. And the next. So that's the story of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911. It was the worst industrial disaster in the city's history then and still. Okay, so I've now said several times, maybe a little grandly, that the Triangle Fire had huge consequences. Let's get into them. First, the Triangle Fire is a big part of the reason that we think of the West 30s as the garment district. See, the Triangle Factory's location was just off Washington Square Park and less than 2 blocks away from Fifth Avenue. The building it was in was part of the garment industry's then recent spread north from the Lower East Side. Loft buildings housing hundreds of garment firms sprang up along Lower Fifth Avenue, bringing noise and traffic and low-paid, often immigrant workers to the city's proudest avenue, besmirching its exclusivity, much to the dismay of the uniquely powerful Fifth Avenue Association, which had some of the city's leading and most powerful citizens as members. The Fifth Avenue Association had already begun a campaign against the rag trade when the Triangle Fire happened, and it immediately jumped on the disaster as proof that the industry had to get lost. The association persuaded the city's banks to boycott financing any garment maker in the area and published a salvo of exposés against the industry. And the Fifth Avenue Association's campaign worked. The garment industry uprooted itself en masse and moved west and north away from Fifth Avenue and over to the relatively open land around 7th Avenue and 34th Street. By 1925, there were 40 industrial loft projects underway in the new area, an investment of over $50 million. So the Triangle Fire reordered the city's geographic and economic map. That's the first concentric circle of consequences. The next circle was political. The organizing of the garment workers under the ILGWU and so forth, and the immigrant radicalism that underlay it, had managed to unionize the biggest industry in town. And after near a century of almost nothing but defeats for labor, this was really an historic accomplishment. And since the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened the very next year after the Great Garment Wars, the political soil had already been prepared. Quickly mobilized, the working classes turned out to the tune of over 400,000 for the Triangle Funeral March, and their massive attendance riveted the local and national newspaper and trained public attention onto the human tragedy caused by the fire. Pretty quickly, the city's political machine was forced to move in a progressive direction in order to retain an electoral base that was increasingly Jewish and activist. Electoral barriers had until this point tended to keep the new immigrants away from elective office, but Triangle changed that. Suddenly, Jewish and Italian immigrants and their children began running for and winning elected offices, and as they did, they brought their community's concerns along with them. For example, in 1917, a Jewish immigrant from Minsk named Charny Vladek got elected to the city's Board of Aldermen on a Socialist Party ticket, advocating public housing and labor organizing. And in 1916, an Italian immigrant got elected to Congress from New York City. His name, it was Fiorello LaGuardia. So there's the next concentric circle. Now, what with all the public outrage over the fire, the mass mobilization around it, and the rising tide of immigrant political ambition, it wasn't long before the Triangle Fire began to show up in legislation. The city enacted several dozen new regulations involving structural safety in the wake of the fire. Fire escape rules were stiffened. Exit doors had to open outwards so panicked people inside didn't get in their own way. Those doors had to open onto landings rather than the steps themselves so that people wouldn't all start falling down the stairs. Commercial buildings had to have a solid yard of masonry in between the courses of windows on each floor in order to slow the tendency of fire to spread upward. And more than mere fire escapes, commercial loft buildings had to have fire towers, solid brick-enclosed staircases that were open to the outside on one side so that they wouldn't become choked with smoke. And sprinklers became mandatory. You can see the result of these code changes in the new environment the industry built for itself in the new garment district. Next slide, please. Airy factory floors with high ceilings, brightly lit by fireproof metal-framed windows, all courtesy of those post-triangle safety regulations. Next slide, please. As a side effect, the industry got a fresh start in the new garment center, and it made a concerted effort to replace its disreputable sweatshop image with an aura of glamour, as in this next slide. Worlds away from the Triangle Fire, wouldn't you say? Another consequence in the city's legal and regulatory regime was zoning. The city enacted the nation's first zoning law a few years after the Triangle Fire in 1916, and among other things, zoning regulated where industrial development could go, and zoning maps were drawn to keep industry off of Fifth Avenue by separating industrial areas from commercial and residential ones, just as the Fifth Avenue Association had wanted. Now, maybe zoning would have gone this way even without Triangle, but there's no question Triangle helped push zoning over the finish line. So, changes in cities' regulations, that's another concentric circle. Next come changes at the state level. And in order to get into this, I have to introduce you to some of our big stars tonight, Al Smith and Robert Wagner. Next slide, please. Al Smith was a second-generation Italian Irish immigrant. No, he wasn't an immigrant, forgive me. He was second-generation Irish-Italian from a very, very impoverished Lower East Side family. Through the city's political machine, Tammany Hall, Smith got himself elected to the state assembly in 1904. And once in, he was reelected steadily. Next slide, please. As for Robert Wagner, he was a German immigrant whose family settled in Yorkville on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Wagner got elected to the state assembly in 1905 and moved up to the state senate in 1909. Next, in the aftermath of the Triangle Fire, a labor activist from a wealthy Boston family, a woman named Frances Perkins, next slide, persuaded Al Smith to meet with some of the survivors and families of the Triangle dead. Smith was seared by this experience, and he wound up serving as vice chairman of a new state committee that was created to investigate factory conditions in the wake of the fire. And the chair of the new committee was Robert Wagner. Smith and Wagner held a series of investigations across the state. They interviewed 222 witnesses and took 3,500 pages of testimony that began with issues of fire safety and moved on to broader questions of industrial injury and death in the workplace. The result was that between 1912 and 1914, the state enacted over 36 health and safety regulations that set minimum standards for industrial lighting and ventilation, child labor, tough new fire rules, measures to protect public health. And by making all this happen, Smith and Wagner became leading reformers and political stars. Thanks to them and others, the city's democratic machine's reputation began to shift from merely corrupt into a champion for workers. It was the beginning of the Democratic Party's move away from the pro-slavery and anti-workers' rights stance that it had held for generations. And it's at this moment that New York became the nation's leader in progressive policy. So there's another concentric circle. Smith and Wagner had helped to implement a concept that was new in America, that political power should be used to protect the powerless. They helped build the era's progressive movement into a massive, massive political wave that made Robert Wagner a United States Senator and made Al Smith governor of the state of New York. And as governor, Smith created the state park system, reformed civil service, and strengthened the state's regulations on workers' compensation, pensions, and child labor. But what I really want to emphasize is what came next. Al Smith became the first Catholic to win a major party's nomination for president. The Democratic Party firmly established its new identity as the working man's spokesman by adopting this up-from-the-slums crusading Triangle Fire activist as its candidate for president of the United States. And the concentric circles don't stop there. No. The post-Triangle political and policy repercussions became fundamental to the entire New Deal era under the leadership of another New Yorker, Smith's successor as governor, the Honorable Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who took the state's progressive agenda and much of its personnel with him to Washington in 1932. Public housing, immigrant activism, unions, worker safety, all those good New York ideas came to Washington with FDR. What do I mean by that? Well, consider this. You may have heard of the Wagner Labor Relations Act, the law that legalized unions in the United States. Yeah, that Wagner Act. Well, the Wagner in that act is the very same Senator Robert Wagner we've been talking about, the adopted son of Yorkville, the other great Triangle reformer besides Al Smith, made union organizing a national right for the first time in our history. Wagner also pushed the National Recovery Act in 1932, which kicked off the New Deal, and the Housing Act of 1937, which created national programs of low and middle income housing. And he drafted and introduced the Social Security Act. His son, by the way, served as the city's mayor from 1954 to 65 until he was beaten by John Lindsay. In the 1980s and 90s, Senator Wagner's grandson served as deputy mayor and head of the City Planning Commission and president of the Board of Education. Nothing shabby about that family dynasty, huh? And lots more New Yorkers were imported by FDR to flesh out the New Deal. Take, for instance, the first head of the Department of Labor, the new agency created by the Wagner Act. FDR's first appointee to that position and the longest-serving person ever to hold the job of Secretary of Labor, it was Frances Perkins, the union organizer who got Al Smith involved with the Triangle Fire to begin with. Perkins became the first woman to join a presidential candidate, and what's more, she helped write the pivotal Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. The Fair Labor Standards Act was probably the last major achievement of the New Deal. It established the 40-hour work week, outlawed child labor, set the first minimum wage, and adopted the concept of time and a half for overtime. Next slide, please. So we have Smith, Perkins, and Wagner helping lead the nation toward the progressive and immigrant-driven concepts of economic and job and worksite security, reducing the depth of wage work servitude, creating some protections for old age and for life apart from work, all of which had been cherished ideals in New York City for decades. But the concentric circles don't end even here, because just as these policy achievements continue to be bedrock parts of our society, so does opposition to them. And we can close the PowerPoint at this point. In its day, the New Deal was repeatedly attacked as socialist, as un-American, as an infringement on personal liberty. And once the crises of the Depression and World War II were over and FDR died and Francis Perkins left the Department of Labor, the forces of reaction set in. Under the banner of freedom and real America, the new Republican congressional majority, which included a young Richard Nixon, almost immediately passed the Taft-Hartley Act, overriding a presidential veto to make it happen. Taft-Hartley significantly weakened the Wagner Act and is widely credited with halting the advance of organized labor in the United States. And Taft-Hartley was only the beginning of the right-wing resurgence against the Triangle Fire coalition. Here's another example. What we now call urban renewal came out of the 1937 Housing Act. But just as the Wagner Act got blunted by Taft-Hartley, urban renewal's idealistic goals were so compromised by the right that by the time urban renewal really got underway in the 1950s, some of its own leading advocates disowned it. Take Catherine Bauer, for example. She was the principal author of the 1937 Housing Act and still another New Yorker who came to Washington with FDR. Well, Catherine Bauer said that public housing drags along in a kind of limbo, not dead, but never more than half alive. And on a broader level, the New Deal's openness to left-wing thought and immigrant activism was all but completely destroyed during the Red Scare, which dominated American politics in the 1950s. And these reactive, not to say reactionary developments, bred a contrary pushback some years later. That pushback was a big part of what we call the 60s. The 60s clearly showed the pendulum swinging back in the direction of the Triangle Coalition's values, and that swing in turn bred a reverter in the Reagan era and the Trump era, during which the right successfully counterattacked for decade after decade. And the pendulum swing continues, although it's hard to say right now where it's going because there seems to be such enormous energy on both sides. Now, in fairness, that pendulum existed long before Triangle. There's a long history of up-from-below activism in the United States, beginning in the 1830s with the Working Man's Party and continuing through the Farmers Alliance, the Populists, the Wobblies, and lots more. But it was only with the Triangle Coalition that the other side of the tracks finally got to create actual legislation and implement actual policies on a national level. Their achievements transformed our country right down to the present day, and it arose directly from the activism and determination of New York's immigrants, focused and sharpened by the inferno at the Triangle Shirtwaist. And it's because of that that the poles of the American pendulum are still defined by the circles of reform and reaction kicked off by Triangle. That is an astonishing, and in the politically paralyzed 21st century, an almost unimaginable set of consequences for one factory fire. Truly, it's something like the chaos theory hypothesis that the beat of a butterfly wing can change the world. Today, I frankly think you have to wonder whether if Triangle had happened today, whether there would have been any consequences at all. But that, of course, is a very different topic for another time. So, thank you very much.